Members of Budget Committee, please report to Community Room 1 for quorum.
Okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. Everybody can grab their seats. We have an exciting day ahead. We do have quorum, so I'd like to call this 39th meeting of the Budget Committee. 39, by the way. This is the 39th meeting of the Budget Committee. Welcome all members, of course, the committee, any visiting councillors and members of the public. We acknowledge that we are meeting today on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and home to many diverse and Indigenous peoples. And if you want to watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live, or you can follow on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at toronto.ca/council. Just want to remind everybody today that Hanukkah begins at sundown today, so we are going to be ending at 3:30 today. So our challenge will be today is, again, if we do not get, we're going to be doing cluster A today. If we don't get done by 3:30, we'll be moving that to Thursday. So I'm hoping that, again, with Thursday, we have a big agenda as well. So hoping we can be disciplined enough to be able to get through that, but we'll see. And we'll have to just play it by ear. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Seeing none. We're going to get to the presentation shortly. What we'll do, there'll be a presentation of the overall cluster A, and we'll have opportunity to ask questions, and then we'll get into the details of each division. So we'll go through each division, and all councillors will have an opportunity to ask questions on each division. We've done this pretty much every year. I also want, if there are any motions or particularly briefing note requests, because this is one long meeting, I would request that you get them into the clerks as soon as possible. So by the end of the week, we'll be able to compile all of them. Some years we've had quite a few. So I'd prefer if you can get them in just so, and give permission from the clerks for myself and Josie to be able to review them. So by the end of the week, we'll get a sense of how many we have. And then on, I believe, next week or on Friday, no, sorry, on Monday. Monday's the last meeting of this part of it. And then we'll move those motions for briefing notes for the next session. Then they'll come to us after the holidays. So, Councillor?
But so this is really for us to be fully briefed on everything that we need to know, and if there's any gaps, we ask for a briefing note. But it's not the time for us to move motions.
No, there are no
ins and outs and that.
That's
going to be in the new year. Great. Okay.
They are when we get into the wrap-up sessions. Okay. But these are, as you said, for any briefing notes after you've gone through all of the questions. There's still information you feel you need. But again, in years past, we've had quite a few briefing notes, so we try to organize them as best as possible. And it just allows staff time to look at them more clearly. So, but if you can do that as quickly as possible, that would be much appreciated. So we don't get 30, 40 of them in at the last moment. Again, this is a multi-day meeting, so we'll be beginning today. There are 4 sessions. There's today, there's Thursday, there's Friday, and then there's Monday. So that Monday, it's the equivalent of 1 full meeting. Any other questions before we begin the presentations? Okay, I believe, Juliana, you're going to be doing the presentation on Cluster A.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present at a pretty quick summary of Cluster A's preliminary 2018 capital and operating budget. So this is just an outline of today's presentation, and in the interest of time, to try and speed us along, I'm not going to be speaking in detail to all of the slides. We will respond to questions at the end, and we've provided more detailed information in the appendices, and this is just a list of those appendices. So we're just going to start with a quick overview of the cluster. So the cluster is made up of 10 divisions or program areas, and each of those areas are responsible for delivering a variety of services. Those services are described in more detail within the budget notes that you have. And we also have a number of capital assets that the program areas maintain and operate in the delivery of their various programs. We have everything from child care centers, heritage properties, long-term care homes, ambulance stations, right through to shelters, and our extensive network of parks and recreational facilities. In terms of our workforce, the cluster's workforce is approximately 12,850 positions. Those include 212 capital positions. A third of our workforce is in parks, forestry, and recreation, and about 22% of those positions are temporary positions, and again, most of those temporary positions fall within parks, forestry, and rec. This next slide just shows the staffing trend, excluding capital positions, from 2009 right to today, and then the outlook for 2012 and 2020. So in those early first 2 years, you'll see an increase there in FTEs, and that's largely driven by the increasing OW or social assistance caseload. We have decreases in 11 and 12, and those are largely due to the temporary closure of Kipling Acres long-term care home that we redeveloped. And there's various efficiencies, mostly in Toronto Employment and Social Services and Parks, Forestry, and Rec. We have increases from 13 to 16, and those are largely driven by the opening of new community centres, new parks and recreational facilities. We also reopened phase 1 of Kipling Acres and brought 145 beds back on stream. And we added, over those 4 years, 220 paramedics phased in, and that was in order to meet a growing need in the service area and the service demand area, and that's all associated with a growing and aging population here at the city. We had a substantial decrease in 2017, but that's primarily the cleanup of positions. We deleted unfunded and gap positions and temporary positions that were no longer required, so there was no impact in service. And in 2018, we have a smaller decrease of 6.6 positions. However, we did invest and bring in additional positions within children's services and long-term care homes, and that was to meet legislative requirements with regard to resident acuity in the long-term care homes and to meet some new legislated staffing ratios in children's services. And those increases were offset by decreases, again, largely in employment and social services and court services, and that's associated with efficiencies that we're bringing in, with the drop in caseload, as well as the introduction of the administrative penalty system for parking violations. In 2019, we anticipate a decrease as well, and that's again associated with the decreasing caseload in social assistance, and so we're streamlining our operations to accommodate that. And in 2020, we have an increase there of approximately 18 positions, and that's due, they're fully funded positions by the province, and it's related to the resident acuity in our long-term care homes. So we have our vacancy levels here with comparison to prior years, and I'm pleased to report that the projected year-end vacancy rate for Cluster A is at 1.8%, and when you consider the fact that as a cluster we budget gapping at 1.7, I think we're doing extremely well this year in terms of filling our vacancies. I'm now just going to quickly provide an overview of the operating budget, and I'm going to start by quickly touching on some of our key accomplishments in 2017. It was quite a productive year for the cluster, and in particular the work we did in helping advance Council's poverty reduction objectives. We launched the Open Door program. We implemented an implementation plan for the first phase of Tenants First, which is our TCHC transformation and the transformation of the broader social housing sector. We increased the number of shelter beds by 18% over the year. We developed and launched a plan on how to grow the city's child care system to better meet demand and affordability. We expanded our student nutrition program, and we moved forward and developed and implemented the social procurement program, and it was the first program of its kind in Canada, and we introduced the second phase of our human services integration. So Last year, we consolidated our online services and introduced a finder tool, and this year we consolidated 67 different intake lines into one number. We have some additional achievements here on this slide, and I just want to highlight not all of them, but the work that was done in terms of advancing Council's equity and inclusion goals. So we developed the Anti-Black Racism Action Plan, the Toronto for All campaign, and the tool that the staff developed in order to bring that equity perspective to the city's budget review process. Many of the key service challenges that the cluster is continually focused on and paying attention to relate to the changing needs of a growing and evolving city, and in particular the complex needs that we find in Toronto's more vulnerable residents and the most vulnerable communities in our city. But we do have plans in place to help meet those challenges and those needs, and I'm not going to name them all. We've reported them all through committee and council, and some of the more significant ones are identified here on the slide. As always, business transformation and modernization continues to be a focus for the cluster, and this slide just captures a small sampling of those initiatives. The appendices provide more detailed information, and all of the transformation initiatives are centered around our clients and our customers and how best to improve services and service outcomes. And that's both from a system perspective, a system-wide perspective, as well as a service level perspective. So we'll now just look quickly at the operating budget. So the 2018 gross operating budget for Cluster A lands at $3.6 billion, and a third of that, $1.1 billion, is dedicated to employment and social services. A quarter is allocated to housing, and then children's services and parks, forestry, and recreation each account for 15% and 13% respectively of our gross budget. And in terms of funding, which is the pie on the right-hand side, 57% of our budget is funded through provincial and federal subsidies, so we have a lot of cost-shared programs. A third is funded through the property tax base, and user fees generate just under 5% of our funds. So this next slide just shows our net operating budget, which is the amount that is funded through that tax base, that $1.2 billion. And housing and parks, forestry, and recreation combined account for 65% of our net budget. This next slide just summarizes the 2008 gross and net preliminary budget by program area with a comparison to 2017. And despite some pretty significant pressures that we were facing, the cluster's overall budget, including the subsidy that the city provides to Toronto Community Housing, is just over the 2017 approved budget. So we came in at 0.2%. Our key pressures continue to be focused in that housing area. We have the continued loss of federal funds that's associated with the expiry of operating agreements, and the demand for shelters continues to rise, and that results in an $18 million pressure for 2018. We have normal year-over-year cost of living and inflationary increases, and then offsetting those pressures is the provincial upload of Ontario Works, and 2018 is the last year of that upload, so that's just under $22 million this year. So that presents a net pressure of just under $25 million. To help alleviate or mitigate some of those pressures, the divisions undertook a pretty detailed review of their budgets and their services to help identify sustainable reduction options. This slide summarizes the changes. So in total, they identified $22.7 million. The line-by-line review generated $3 million. Base revenue changes generated $5.6, and that's largely just inflationary increases on our user fees, plus a $3 million draw from our social housing reserve. Service efficiencies, which I'm going to talk to on the next slide, contributed $5.3 million. We have some minor service adjustments in economic development of culture that total $130,000, and revenue adjustments brought in $8.6 million. But those revenue adjustments are just their draws from reserves in the areas of children's services and employment and social services. So here, this next slide is the service efficiencies. I'm not going to speak to them in detail. Many are related, though, to the implementation of automated and modernized processes, improved service delivery models, and the streamlining of operations. The preliminary budget also includes some additional resources in the area of long-term care homes. Those resources and the costs associated with them are fully funded by the province, and it's in order to meet those legislative standards that I refer to with respect to resident acuity. In terms of new services, the preliminary budget does include the utility locate service for BIAs, which Council discussed last week. We also have a couple of new revenues, a general admission fee for the Market Gallery, and we have a user fee in court services that relates to requests for photocopies and certified documents. Now, there are a number of new and enhanced services that are not included in this 2018 preliminary budget, but they are provided for Budget Committee's consideration and review. They're detailed in the notes and they're summarized in slides 65 to 68 of this presentation in the appendices section. Looking forward to the next 2 years, we anticipate net incremental impacts of around 4.7 and 4.8% in 19 and 20. And in both those years, we have identified the continued loss of federal funding for social housing. It's quite substantial, particularly by 2020, it hits 20 million. But we are hopeful with the announcement of the National Housing Strategy that the federal government will begin to reinvest those monies back into social housing. But at this point in time, we don't have enough detail on that announcement to actually confirm that, so we've left those in for now. In 2020, we also have a $21 million pressure in TCHC, and that's related to the sinking fund contribution. That contribution has been deferred to 2020, pending the development of a long-term funding model for our housing corporation. Now, before I wrap up the operating budget review, I do want to quickly review TCHC's budget. So just as a reminder, the city's subsidy for TCHC is budgeted and administered under Shelter Support and Housing Administration. You will recall that when Council considered and adopted the tenant's first report, they directed staff to develop an interim funding plan or an interim funding strategy for TCHC through the 2018 budget process to address their operating and capital pressures in the shorter term. And they also asked us to develop a longer-term funding model to be brought forward in 2019 in advance of the 2020 budget. Through that 2017 budget process, TCHC did identify, and these pressures were confirmed through the Mayor's Task Force and the staff review, some significant ongoing operating pressures, and largely driven by stagnant revenues and increasing operating costs, particularly in the area of utilities. So in response to that, City Council last year increased the annual subsidy to the Housing Corporation by $37 million, and that's really helped stabilize the operation. The $2.1 million that you see this year in the preliminary budget for TCHC is actually an increase in our RET sumps to the Housing Corporation, and that's required to preserve 516 RGI units, so rent geared to income units, that would otherwise be lost due to the expiry of federal operating agreements. With respect to the capital, the city's preliminary 10-year capital plan includes $239 million in city debt financing to help address TCHC's shorter-term capital pressures. So for 2018, the plan includes $216 million, and in 19, just over $63 million. So this is the first time that the city is actually going to be borrowing on behalf of its housing corporation. And this investment over the next 2 years will allow TCHC to continue to move forward with its capital repair program and avoid any further unit closures. And it'll also allow it to continue with current phases of council-approved revitalization projects. It also eliminates that $54 million pressure that's on an operating subsidy side with relation to the capital repair backlog. And as I mentioned, that $18 million sinking fund contribution will be addressed through the long-term funding strategy that's currently being developed and will be reported out later. So TCHC's overall budget is $1 billion. That covers both operating and capital. The vast majority of that budget is dedicated to building repairs, capital development, utilities, and debt repayment. And in terms of funding sources, which is the pie chart on the right, residential rents fund approximately a third of the budget. The city's operating subsidy funds about 23%, and the city debt funding that we're taking out for the first time will fund around 21% of that budget. I'm going to quickly review our 10-year capital plan. Major projects in the 10-year plan, I'm very excited to say, include George Street revitalization. We also have 21 new child care centres, and that's in support of our growth strategy. New community centres are going to be coming online, as well as more parks. We're going to be replacing the ferry boats. We have 2 more multifunctional paramedic stations coming online. The first one came online this year. And we have, as I mentioned, we're going to continue with the in-flight revitalization projects for TCHC. And of course, state of good repair continues to be a focus for the cluster. In 2018, in this particular upcoming year, some of the key priorities are going to be securing shelter sites for the George Street revitalization and our transition plan, moving forward on the choice-based system for helping manage social housing waitlists, expanding our child care system, continuing to develop the multifunction paramedic station, and state of good repair, including meeting the accessibility requirements. The 10-year capital plan in totals $2.6 billion, and approximately half of that is dedicated to parks, forestry, and recreation. And now with the George Street being brought above the line, a third of that capital plan is now dedicated to SSHA, and George Street is budgeted under there. The balance is distributed by among some of our other programs, and the funding, which is the pie chart on the right, you'll see that the majority is funded through debt. $1.8 billion of that is funded through debt, and then we have reserve funds, development charges, and other revenues making up the difference. The 10-year capital plan is dominated by state of good repair and service improvement. So combined, those two areas represent 40% each of the plan, so 80% in total, and then growth-related account for 14% of the capital plan. Looking at our state of good repair backlog, so in 2018, we're just over $5 million in terms of the backlog. It does peak at $658 million in 2026, and it drops slightly and then in 2027. And then there's a number of projects that are currently below the line or not included in the 10-year capital plan. One of the more significant ones being the redevelopment. We have 5 long-term care homes that we still need to redevelop to meet legislated design standards. But George Street is the kickoff. It's developing that first long-term care home, and then the other ones will be hopefully slotted in future years. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. So what we'll do now is we'll go through questions on the presentation. We will be getting, now if you get into questions specifically on any division, we're going to be going through. So if you have questions on a specific division, we'll be getting into those in detail after that. So it's just, these are more just general questions of the presentation. Does anybody have questions of the presentation? Councillor Campbell.
Can you talk a little bit about the George Street revitalization? And you said it used to be below the line, now it's above the line. Can you tell me, like, when did that happen? And because I thought it was still not a funded project.
Bring that project above the line. So that's the redevelopment of Seton House.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah.
As well as we're going to be incorporating not only a shelter, but a community hub and our long-term care home.
And what about, so when that process for George Street gets underway, land has to be acquired?
The land has been acquired through, so there was, George Street, we had certain phases approved in the earlier years, and part of that was acquiring the site. So if I'm recalling correctly, all of the land that we need to purchase has been purchased, and this is really being able to move forward with the actual demolition and construction of the new site.
And then where are those people going to go when that all occurs?
The people that are in the shelters, part of the capital plan identifies transition shelters. So you recall in one of the slides I mentioned that one of the priorities for 2018 is finding transitional shelter sites so we can move people out of Seton House as we redevelop. Okay.
So this was below the line, right, for a long time, for as long as I've been here. How does it all of a sudden, how do we find a source of funding for this?
So through you, Mr. Chair, when we presented the budget on the 30th of November through the capital programming work that we did, we identified sort of 2 strategies that we used. One was looking at everyone's cash flow funding and aligning it to project timing and readiness, and that actually created some debt room as we smoothed out those cash flows over the 10-year period. That gave us some extra debt capacity. And then we also are planning for the additional provincial gas tax funding that we're getting.
Which is about $172 million a year or something.
It's about $158 million a year once it comes up to the 4 cents. That gave us about another $1 billion of capacity through the 10-year period. Combined, we took that capacity and identified 4 key priority areas that we would then bring above the line. Critical social infrastructure was one, so that was how we have been able to accommodate the TCHC additional state of good repair funding for 2 years. George Street, critical state of good repair, AOTA compliance, and some transformation projects.
So this is 537 million spent over what period of time?
I believe it's to
It's the 10-year capital.
2023, yes.
How many years?
3 to 4 years.
3 or 4 years. And so did something drop off in order to make room for this?
Mr. Chair, no.
No. Okay, that's it. That's my questions.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll's next.
Just a quick question, because in this presentation, I don't know if TCHC is going to present specifically, but in this presentation, we've combined the operating and capital, which is just as well, because it's its own separate corporation. We only need the snapshot. But I'm having trouble understanding, there's the interim funding strategy that talks about having 279 funded from debt, and then in the pie chart, it says city capital debt funded subsidy 216 million. So there's an extra piece that I'm missing?
If you recall, I said the city is doing 2 years.
Yeah.
And what's showing on that pie chart is just the 216 or 18 million for 18.
Right.
I mean, there's another 63, I believe, million in the next year.
Oh, okay.
19.
And that's like the second
And then
year
2020,
revites probably.
by 2019, we'll have developed our long-term plan, and we'll bring that forward to see
Okay, okay.
how we're going to move forward.
And while we're doing this program, there is still, the cluster looks to make sure that while we're infusing them with debt to catch up with state of good repair, operating is still operating to a zero balance, not a deficit. All the debt is going to capital, not to operating. Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Burnside.
Thank you. Through you, you mentioned the increase in utilities for TCHC. What was that in a number sense? Like how many millions or hundreds of thousands?
Based on my recollection, revenues are rather stagnant, but utilities are tending to go up about 4% per year, and I have, oh, there they are. So they go up around 4% per year, which represents how much dollars, Roseanne? 140 million a year
For
utilities,
for where? Just TCHC?
for all their buildings.
140 million additional
The total, in total.
is
Or just
140
the
million.
increase?
Yeah, all I care about, I asked just for the increase, sorry.
I'm going to have Roseanne for TCHC come up.
Okay, so let me go back. I recall there was a $2.4 billion identified for, I think it was state of good repair at TCHC. That was identified about 3-4 years ago.
That's correct.
Okay, and this 280 million is part of our contribution towards that, or not?
So council asked us to develop an interim funding model for the next 2 years until we had time to work out with corporate finance and TCHC what a longer-term sustainable model might look like. So for these first 2 years, 18 and 19, the city for the first time is going to be borrowing debt in order to allow TCHC to continue with its capital repair program so we don't have to shut down any more units.
So it's kind of part of that 2.4 billion. Okay, and how much is the province contributing to that 2.4 billion backlog?
I'm going to have, we do have money now starting to come in for the province. I can't remember the 120 million approximately.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, it's 120 million that they will, so over this 2-year period, the City of Toronto, through our debt capacity, will be funding 160 million state of good repair, as well as the 2018 component of the revitalization of 56.
The state of good repair is what I'm after,
Right.
yeah.
So, and then in 2019, the 160 million that the board identified as necessary for state of good repair, 120 of it is coming from the provincial funding that had been announced, and the city is then making up the difference of 40 million.
40 million, okay. And so the province is only a one-time shot, is it, or is it annual? 120?
capital, it's normally one-time shots, but they renew those fundings and they extend the funding sometimes year over year, and a lot of it is related to the efficiency, their efficiency efforts.
Oh, it's part of that gas tax thing. Okay. And, sorry, did you have that number for me, for the utilities?
No, I think he's,
Sorry, my original question was,
your
what does the increase in utilities represent in terms of hundreds of thousands or $1 million annually? The increase, I don't care about the
It's
total.
about $4 million, $4.4 million a year.
So about $1 million every percentage?
So total utilities is about 24% of TCHC's budget, which is about $140 million. That increase is about $4 million, 4% annually.
So which is 4 months, so about every percent that utilities go up represents approximately $1 million?
Correct, yes.
Okay, and is there any offset by other levels of government for that?
No,
No? And is it mostly hydro?
it's mostly hydro, correct.
60 million.
60 million. 60 million,
But in terms of the increase, is it mostly hydro that we're seeing the increase?
I can answer that.
yeah, okay.
So with the recent provincial rate decrease in hydro, we saw about a $13 million annual decrease in our hydro rate, which was appreciated. And the total hydro budget is about 60 million annually when that 13 million comes off.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Nunziata.
Yes, with TCHC, state of good repair. Question. So every year, we're putting, I mean, since I've been on the board as well, millions of dollars in for state of good repair. Do we get a list of what actually has been done, or, you know, which buildings are being done? Because every year we're putting money into it, and then I hear from tenants and buildings, that, well, nothing's being done, nothing's being done. So what are we actually doing in state of good repair? Do we get that list?
so in the past, TCHC, when requested, has provided a list by ward, I believe, by development. By ward, of what investments have.
And every year, when we're putting money in the budget, is that money being used within that year for the repairs that need to be done? Or are we carrying it over? Like,
No, TCHC has been pretty good about investing and spending that money on state of good repair. They've got a good, they spend what they've been provided for, but this is the first year that the city itself is taking on debt to help keep that, drive that program forward.
so how much has TCHC borrowed on its own for its debt?
We've raised about 800 million.
For this debt, so in total, so TCHC sits with about 1.6 billion in debt. About $1 billion has been borrowed for the capital, $800 million for the capital program directly. For the state of good repair.
800 million.
Yes.
Okay, so now as far as the waiting list that we have for TCHC, what's happening with that? Has that been increased, decreased, or what's happening?
So through the chair, the waiting list currently has about 90,000.
Who am I speaking to? Oh, okay.
I can just give you some information on the waiting list.
Yeah.
So there are currently about 90,000 households on the waiting list. 6,000 new households are added to the waiting list every year, and 3,000 households are housed. So every year you see an increase of approximately 3,000 households to the waiting list.
Okay, and most of them, are some of them just transfers, or I mean, they're not on, obviously they're not on the street, they're just transfers, right?
Through the chair, so these are 3,000 new households coming into TCHC as households leave. So there's 6,000 are added to the list, but 3,000 new are housed every year.
3,000. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other councilors in the committee? Not any outside councillors for questions? We'll have another opportunity as we work down the list if there's questions on TCHC, so, okay. Okay, seeing none, thank you very much, Juliana. So what we're going to do, we have all of the pertinent staff are in the room. So you have a list in front of you, and we'll work down through the divisions on questions. So the first is Toronto Paramedic Services. Do we have any questions on Toronto Paramedic Services? Well, I think it was thank you for sitting down and being prepared to answer questions, but I think the committee is, I don't think there are any questions. Oh, Councillor Campbell has a question. Councillor Campbell has a question.
So last year you received some new staffing. Can you tell me how that was to alleviate an overwork situation? Can you just tell me a little bit about that, how that's worked out, if everyone was hired that was funded to be hired?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. Last year we hired 56 new FTE paramedics that were funded from the province. That was part of the 220 FTE commitment from council over 4 years. They were all hired. And in terms of outcomes, our performance, response time performance continues to improve. We're 11 minutes, 24 seconds in 2016. We've increased our unit hours to respond to that 3 to 5% growth that we experience every year in call demand. So to answer your question, we've hired all the staff, and we've been effective at responding to the community's calls.
Okay, and are there any moves in the department to for looking for service efficiencies, or you've got your own places, fire department's got their own places? Are there any co-location initiatives underway? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Through the chair, our multifunction station project, the first one came in line this fall in October on the Wilson Street in Ward 9 was one of our first moves in terms of efficiencies. So that project, it's outlined in our capital budget notes on page 3, speaks to the efficiencies of a large-scale operation where paramedics are focused on paramedics responding to calls, and we've incorporated logistics staff in supporting the paramedics in cleaning, stocking vehicles. That returns unit hours into the organization and turns them onto the street. It also helps reduce paramedic overtime, and it also improves our logistical flow of equipment, so spoilage, more preventative maintenance. We do have one project in the future that we're working with our real estate partners as well as fire services co-locating up in the Woodbine area.
In regard to paramedic overtime, what's the number one driving element that pushes overtime hours up? Is it wait times in hospitals? Or delivery of patients? What is it?
Through the chair, it's a difficult question to answer at times in terms of the overtime expenditures. They are related to full shift overtime. Our call demand still increases at 3 to 5%, and we do find ourselves delayed at hospital at times. However, that has stabilized over the last couple of years with support from the province and moving forward to those pieces. End of shift overtime, it contributes to overtime costs as well as absenteeism, and we've been working towards fairly effective mechanisms. If you look at our overtime over the last 3 years, it's under 5 million, whereas in 2012 it was over 6 million. So we've been successful at reducing that.
You mentioned absenteeism. Is that a concern?
No. Through the chair, we've been working very, very diligently with our absenteeism. Our sick time is down. A few years back it was about 11 days per year, and this year we're on target for 9 days per year. So we're very diligent at managing that. It's one of our key performance indicators, so we manage it daily and work significant effort on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Burnside.
Good morning. You mentioned that you're diligently working on the, I'll say, the sick file. What do you attribute your success to for bringing it down by about 20%?
As I mentioned through the chair, it's one of our key performance indicators, so our management team report on it monthly. We follow our sick time on a daily basis. and we follow our staff very, very carefully. And it's also tied to our employee health and wellness program. So we follow up with our staff in terms of their wellness on a regular basis. We use wellness checks with our staff to follow up, as well as our workload component. Since we've added the additional unit hours and paramedics to respond to calls, our workload is much more balanced, and we're supporting our staff in that way with some other aspects of our wellness program. So we've added additional support in terms of a targeted program for that perspective. We've implemented Road to Medal Readiness, which is a best practice tool provided by the Medical Commission of Canada. And we've also introduced an online tool for staff to do self-assessments. So it's been a very successful component of that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. Next is court services. Any questions on court services? Hold on. I think we're good on court services. There we go. Economic development and culture is the next division. Nobody wanted to ask questions. I asked if anybody wanted to ask questions and nobody did, so. Did you have questions on court services? Okay. Okay, and economic development and culture? Okay, so we'll begin with questions of economic development and culture. Councillor Nunziata, did you indicate you had questions? Okay. Councillor Campbell does.
I'll ask a question to do my job as a city councillor, Mr. Chair. Can we talk a little bit about, I know arts funding is a major part of your mandate, and can you talk a little bit about the economic development aspect in terms of attracting companies to come to Toronto, and what's been successful, what's working, sort of on a cost-benefit basis? How much are we investing to bring companies here, and what are some of the outcomes?
So the attraction function, foreign direct investment attraction function, was resting with Invest Toronto, which was a separate wholly owned corporation of the city, of which about $2.5 million, with their annual budget was in the range of $2.5 million, funded from revenue provided by the Toronto Portlands Company. So it went from Toronto Portlands Company to Invest Toronto. Recently, as you may know, as you obviously know, Invest Toronto and the Greater Toronto Marketing Alliance have folded into an organization called Toronto Global, which is cost shared now with the province, the federal government, and the local municipalities and regions. The City of Toronto's contribution to that is just under $1 million, under $1 million. And so that money flows from TPLC into the city and back out to Toronto Global. So Toronto Global is new. They have a range of strategies, much like Invest Toronto did. They include emissions to different target markets, and they target different sectors and different geographies. The U.S. being a prime one, Europe, China are the leading ones, some parts of Europe. They target missions, they target individual companies. A prime one obviously is the Amazon bid that came out.
So has this new entity is just getting started, correct?
Correct.
And so is that essentially taking over the role of economic development for the City of Toronto?
Well, in terms of foreign direct investment, that role has been taken over for 9 years because Invest Toronto took it over when it was founded in 2009, and then Toronto Global. So we in Economic Development Culture support those efforts. For instance, many companies are interested in sector-specific information. We have 10, 12 sector specialists, so we will ask those folks to support Toronto Global when they're pitching to a particular company.
Okay. How much is the department's travel budget?
About $500,000.
500,000. And for what kind of purposes is that? Is that what is?
Those would be trade missions, as well as missions to support, formerly Invest Toronto, now Toronto Global, in their work. We also have partner cities.
Trade missions are to attract foreign companies?
Trade missions are mostly to try to increase trade, exports from Toronto-based companies to the rest of the world. That is not a responsibility of Toronto Global, so that's our responsibility.
Okay. And can you highlight some key success stories that have occurred, you know, from some of these missions?
So from a trade perspective over the years, we've formed a relationship with Austin, and we've gone down there, and so there's been investments in the music industry as a result of that. Our trips to China have resulted in a number of major investments, Greenland being probably the most famous one, but there are other investments from that. In our European invested trips to Israel, to UK, to a couple of other countries, have resulted in a number of tech companies moving here to invest in the city and start up here.
Okay. And from an export standpoint, could you quantify, you know, an increase or a measure of exports that have occurred as a result of our efforts?
We're currently preparing a report to answer that very question. Okay. We partner with the World Trade Center, which is a Toronto Region Board of Trade subsidiary, and they've been providing both training to Toronto-based companies, their TAP program and a 101, which is an introductory program. They've been tracking very closely and have some positive results. I don't have the report yet, but it will be in front of you before the end of the budget consideration process.
Thank you. That's my questions.
Thank you. Next, Councillor Carroll.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Williams got half the way there. Some people jumped when the whole budget was launched and they saw that shrinkage in the budget, which is primarily from Canada 150, but it's kind of blended with what's happening with Global Toronto, isn't it? So we now have a new way of moving money in and out. Is that amount changing?
No, so that hasn't affected our net budget at all, really.
Okay.
Because on the Canada 150, that was drawn from a reserve, so the monies there were a net zero to our operating budget. But our gross dropped significantly as a result of the ending of that program. With respect to the monies that we put in to our international activities, they were supported from funds that came from Toronto Portland's company into non-program revenue and then are transferred to our budget. So those are net zero as well. Okay. So the $1 million is a net zero to our budget.
Okay. And some specific things, Mr. Chair, on the service changes. We see a change in there. A lot of museum rates are going up, and at the same time, the thing that was managed through the libraries with Sun Life, the museum pass, is disappearing. Is economic development, because they've lost their sponsorship, is economic development or the partnership office helping in trying to keep that program alive? Because if the rates are going up and at the same time the free pass is disappearing for low income and new Canadians, we got a problem.
Right. No, we continue through through both the top office and our own direct sponsorship. A good example most recently is Mackenzie Investments contribute as part of their 150 program to making the entrance to our museums free for 2 months this year, which is a great trial because we think that may be an opportunity to involve more companies in making more widely access to our cultural facilities. I don't have a question for you, or I don't have an answer for your question with regard to the library program, and I'll get that for you, Councillor.
Yeah, if we could figure out so that we're communicating it the right way. If we're going to go with time-specific sponsorships versus the past sponsorship, whichever, but if there can be some working together to make sure that accessibility is addressed. And then the other one is the Squares program. No Canada Day at Mel Lastman Square, them's fighting words. Well, there's two. There's the Squares program and the Downsview Park program, and both of them, they all have equity impacts.
Right. So
is there any effort being made to replace that with partnerships?
So the downtown squares, that was to take away the music at our Tasty Thursdays, which were creating about as much problem as there was enjoyment, and there weren't a lot of people standing in front of the stage, so that seemed a sensible. We tried that, didn't work, so move on. With regard to the candidate programs, we are trying to work out a equitable distribution of candidate programs across the city, and we'll work on that in 2018. That's simply a step to allow us to start from a base that makes sense.
Okay, and the Downsview Park Alliance.
That was a vestige program that had no policy basis or program basis, and we're trying to work with all our community partners to create, if we have to set up a program or to fit them into existing programs. And that's one that's orphan, and we need to work it out. Pardon?
Or to find some sort of home for the Steel Pan Group.
And they also have Toronto Arts Council they can turn to. Those kind of situations, we'd prefer to look at that as another option.
Okay, if I got time for one more question, Mr. Chair. And lastly, culture grants, minor and major. We expect on Deputation Day, we're going to hear about their future plans. That, you know, if we get to $25, we have, hooray, achieved 2001 funding levels for other cities. But we expect they'll be coming and presenting their new program. What is economic development doing in terms of being able to give us a multi-year outlook of how we would respond to that?
So we are in 18 going to go through a major review of our grants programs for the majors to examine whether our funding is meeting all of the city's goals with regard to equity, diversity, geographic, elsewheres. And we will report back to council. We'll do a lot of close consultation with the community, obviously, in that process. It'll take the full year to do that. Our challenge, of course, is that there are a lot of new cultural organizations being founded, and we need to find ways to weigh their needs and requests along with the existing majors, the Lassos, Toronto Arts Council, et cetera.
Right, okay, thank you.
And the balance of program, or the balance of granting programs between what we do directly and what Toronto Arts Council does, and to make sure there's a logic to all of that.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Next, Councilor Nunziata.
Just one question. It's wonderful, you know, the question was asked, you're promoting all this businesses, new businesses to come into the city. But what are we actually doing in helping the suburbs where we have vacant buildings, vacant storefronts, depressed area where we need help and we're not getting it? So why are we not concentrating in some of these areas that need the support and not just downtown?
So with the existing resources, we do the best we can, but you'll notice in our budget that there is a below-the-line item focused on distressed retail areas. There being 4 or 5 council motions asking us to look into that. So there is a series of immediate steps to take, and one of them affects your ward along Eglinton. And 2, a study to take a look at the full complexity of retail, because not only do we have issues in many strips, if we will, but we also have an overall challenge of online shopping and the shifts there that are exacerbating some of the issues. So we are doing that. You'll remember that council has already indicated directionally that some of the money saved from the vacant unit rebate cancellation will be directed to this purpose, and we will be presenting during the course of this year a report to council with detailed recommendations on how we can best address these issues. So we are finally moving on this, Councillor.
So are you going to go to these areas, like in my area, Mount Eglinton and Weston Road, where we need help? And when are you going to go down there and look at it?
So while I did a tour with you a number of years ago, so I'm well aware of the area.
Yeah, I mean, really?
I know, and we've been there. We're doing work in Weston, Mount Dennis to help as well, a significant amount of work there. So, but just a little bit more patience with this program, and we'll be able to put real dollars into the program.
I don't have patience.
Thank you. Councillor Burnside.
Thank you. Through you. I just wanted to get back on the Invest Toronto thing. So Invest Toronto's job is to attract business to the city, correct?
I just interrupt. Yeah, Invest Toronto no longer exists.
Okay, whatever.
Toronto Global.
Okay, so what it's morphed into.
Which is a regional body with significant.
Oh, for GTA, that's right. Okay, thanks. And then, so you say that you go with Toronto Global for support. What does that mean?
Well, it can be either a trip that we would do, that Toronto Global would be supporting us, or Toronto Global is just starting. So an example would be Toronto Global took a mission to New York City about a month ago. The mayor helped lead that mission, and we had staff go in support of that to line up meetings, to make sure that we can follow through on all of the meetings that are relevant to a potential investment in Toronto, to reach out and form stronger bonds with organizations locally in New York. So for instance, the Trade Commission office, and have sort of a first name relationship, because they are often the first point of contact for a potential investment moving to Toronto.
So would you see that your role decreasing as they get up and running?
No, I think our role would be the same as it has been. I think as they get up and running, they will have more trips. We have a limited budget to be able to accompany them on all of them, and in many of those, it won't be appropriate to us to accompany it. But I can see it happening on a occasional basis that we would physically accompany them. We would certainly provide background information for them on any trip, and more importantly, when they develop a lead of a company, we would then work closely with them to help close it.
Okay, and then you were talking, Councillor Campbell asked in terms of measurement of success, and you mentioned a tech company. One of your measurements was a tech company moving here, but that would be not really your role, would it? I thought you were more about exports.
Correct. So the question was examples of companies that came here, and I was answering that particular question.
Oh, okay.
In terms of export, as I explained, World Trade Center is preparing a report on that specific item. It'll be front of this committee before you finish your deliberations. So I can't answer.
But yeah, so I just want to clarify that that report will be talking more about exports as opposed to companies coming here.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly what it'll be talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mahevick's next.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm working from this Appendix 3.4 that was presented at the budget launch last week. So I think that's where the rubber's going to hit the road.
What page? Can you help me here?
It's page 17 of 20. From this preliminary, 2018 preliminary operating funding. Oh, it's very fine print.
I don't think
No, it's a summary chart. Yeah.
Yes, that's what he's looking at.
Okay. Okay. Good.
Okay, yes.
Is it 67, 65?
I'd ask staff to expand it, just specific to economic development. Okay, so your base, basically at the end of the day, Mr. Williams, your base is pretty funded, but I'm wondering about these pieces here. I think Councillor Nunziata asked about the study of the current state and future of cities' retail, right? That's $200,000? You're making
That's the particular study that I referred to. So that list has 3 different buckets of expenditures. actually two buckets of expenditures. So, or three, sorry, no, three. So one is below the line cultural, suggested allocation of the 2 million that Councillor Carroll alluded to, which is the last 2 million to make the $25 per capita target, if the Budget Committee and Council so wishes.
And which ones are they? They're the...
So Indigenous culture, major cultural organizations, museums,
Right.
The music strategy, New Year's Eve, public art. Those are the three, and Toronto Arts Council is there too. And increased grants to specialized collection museums. Those items all add up to $2 million. And their staff's recommendation of an allocation, if council so wished, of $2 million to make the $25 per capita target the council committed to.
Okay, great. And then the other bucket is...
The other bucket is the Toronto Significant Events Investment Program, which are major special events. There's a reserve for that, and we ran an intake in the fall, late fall, and this is a potential recommendation for that allocation. I believe Josie wanted to comment on that too. No?
But that's coming from a reserve?
That comes from a reserve, and then the balance of the items are with respect to getting going on helping on the distressed retail areas, which is immediate funding, and that would, if agreed to, that would come out of the vacant unit rebate savings that are going to begin, not be full, but begin in 2018.
Okay, so the last question then, for me anyway, is there was a delegation that came from the, I'm not exactly sure, Toronto Arts Council Foundation, talking about the 2 million. I thought that what they meant was to take it to $25, that they thought, because they had said, okay, we'll pass last year because, or 2 years ago because of the Pan Am Games, and before that it was something else, and they were asking, when is it our shot to get that full $2 million? And I only see $500,000 there. Or am I kind of misinterpreting it? Are you saying it's a larger bucket?
No, so the Toronto Arts Council has got a very significant funding. I think we've added $17.5 million in total, or $15.5 million in total. And of that, I think 30 or 40% has already gone to the Toronto Arts Council. So we've been significantly, I think their grants are up 40 or 50% now as a result of this increased funding. This is just the last tranche, if you will, and their share of that tranche, which in this case is 25%.
I see. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a few questions myself, then we'll go to outside councillors. So on that, the $2 million arts fund, if we support that, what process did you go through in determining who got what?
So it's just a staff-led process based upon our consultations during the year with all of our key cultural stakeholders, and against an assessment of ensuring that council's priorities with regard to diversity, both geographically and ethnoculturally, were met, was based upon trying to balance out some of the groups that had started from very small base and needed sort of a higher than a flat percentage increase across the board. It was based on the needs, as we interpreted it, of different programs. So for instance, on the small and medium-sized specialized museums, MOCA is restarting operations, so we wanted to put a little extra into that. Harborfront, we were trying to help stabilize that organization, so we wanted to assign some extra money to that. So there were a number of special circumstances we were also taking into account.
Okay, and I've noticed there's no increases to the lassos of majors. Now, are they aware of this? And I'm thinking as we get into the delegated part of the process, will they be coming forward to us asking why?
So as I mentioned before, we plan on going through a full program assessment on the grants to those areas to help make sure that all of the money that the city is investing in culture, arts and culture, is achieving all the goals of the city. That may mean some changes and it may not. So until we sort that out, we felt it best to wait.
Okay, and the decision council made last week with regard to the utility cuts for the BIAs, you had budgeted, I guess your recommendation last week was for the 50% you'd budgeted. How much was that, do you recall?
About $137,000.
So the decision from council, of course, was to do 100%, so you now have a pressure of approximately $140,000 going into this?
I'm just being corrected by my colleagues, it's 166.
Okay.
We had felt that we could figure out a way to manage that, half of it. I kind of like Councillor Fletcher's suggestion on the floor last week of using the vacant unit rebate. We have to figure out whether that's possible or not. And so we will have to take a look at our budget and figure it out. We will figure it out.
Okay, but there's at this point an added pressure of $166,000 that we have to figure out. Okay. On the major cultural events, I believe the FIFA World Cup are we looking at making a commitment to that, or will that have an impact or any kind of decision we may have to make this year?
So there is no need to spend money today on the bid for the World Cup. We will bring a report to Executive and Council in January with a recommendation whether to sign some agreements that we're being asked to sign that would have some financial commitments down the road. We will need to work with finance, corporate finance, as to what some of the strategies would be to do that. We have 7 years. I mean, the World Cup is almost 9 years away. We have a number of years to solve that challenge, and we will make some suggestions as to how that potentially could be done. But there is no request for funds immediately.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Councillor Fletcher, you're next.
Thank you very much. Just going back to missions, what is the plan? You must have a yearly plan for missions that you lay out. Here's what we're going to be traveling on this year. Is that something that exists?
We are working on that for 2018.
So you haven't had that?
We haven't fully figured that out. We know there will be fewer this year that involve members of council, but we don't have it right now, no.
But if I asked you for the missions for the previous year, you could go back and put what would have been a plan, but it would have been the actual missions.
We have a listing already on that, Councillor. We could provide that to you if you would.
You have the actual missions?
The actual missions and the costs of each mission.
And the costs. And that includes everything, or is there something under Invest Toronto that would be another mission? So is there economic development missions and then Invest Toronto missions or mayor's missions? How many missions are there, types of missions?
So there were 11 missions last year in which the city spent money or staff time on.
So the 11 missions that the city spent money.
Correct.
And is that, are you calling city money TPLC money, or are you calling that Invest?
No, yeah, I call all of the money city money.
Anything is city money?
Correct.
So there's 11 missions in 2017.
Correct.
And that is going to be accounted for somewhere in?
We can provide, we're assembling that information. We could reply to a briefing note if you wish.
To give that over?
Yep.
And how do you determine who's on a mission?
Depends upon what sectors are involved, where they are, what staff availability is what staff are available, the size of the mission, whether the mayor is going or not, and the support that's needed for the mayor. It's all case specific.
I see. So those missions are staff missions or councillor missions, or who's on your missions?
So again, that varies. It could include the mayor, it could include other members of council with the mayor, could involve other members of council without the mayor. It could involve staff without any members of council.
And so we're going to get that 11?
Yes.
So the film missions would be 2, so there's
Correct.
9 others.
Correct.
What were they? Can you tell me?
So off the top of my head, there are missions to New York, China, India, Europe, several different places. South America, one. I said the U.S., I think, a number of times.
And the, we have a number of different officers. We have innovation officers, we have oversight officers. Are those part of these missions, or is that a separate budget somewhere?
I'm only referring to, I should have been more clear, I'm only referring to missions that involved any ED&C budget or staff. Other members of staff or other counselors unrelated to EDC support, I'm not including that in my response.
Okay, and I'm sorry to press on this, so we'll go back. There wasn't a plan, but there were 11. Some of them were planned. I know the film ones were planned ahead. So maybe 9 weren't planned. And was
There were a number more than that planned, but some things come up during the course of a year, and so we have to be flexible to accommodate that.
Okay, that's fine. And then for New Year's Eve, we're spending 425,000, which we get 200,000. Anyway, net is 225,000. But that really isn't the city's New Year's Eve, is it? That is, it's not our New Year's Eve.
It is now. It is now. We had City TV for a long time, held a New Year's celebration, which was cost. We didn't invest anything in City TV production. They then decided to switch to a rebroadcast of major elements of New York City's New Year's Eve for their own business reasons. We sought out other media outlets to take over the city role. We did not find anybody.
So it's not ours. It's ours now.
It's ours now.
It's ours now.
It's ours now.
And then for the, I've got 6 seconds left. I'll just let it go. I don't have enough time to ask full questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next is long-term care, homes and services. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I wasn't. Okay, questions on long-term care? Councillor Campbell to start.
Just, I see that provincial, in the analyst notes, provincial funding's gone up just over $2 million. What's the increase in the overall operating budget?
The increase in provincial funding, Councillor?
Well, it says, I'm reading the 2018 operating budget includes $2 million in increased provincial funding to address a rise in residents. And
Sorry, so yes, Councillor, that particular adjustment is made each year by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. The adjustment is reflecting rising levels of care, complexity of care, and it's done on a case mix index basis. This particular budget adjustment also includes other changes such as increases in food that is provided to residents. You may recall earlier this year, the province invested a significant amount in raw food. This is reflected on an annualized basis as well. Plus, there's other changes to meet legislative standards.
there was a, correct me if I'm wrong, was there not a reduction in staffing in 2017 where support workers were to go out for training, but then their time on the floor wasn't going to be covered?
Through the chair, that is correct. The adjustment that was made for 2017, we typically would backfill for staff when they go for mandatory training, and as a result of last year's reduction, we changed how we do mandatory training. We have shorter training periods, and we're relying heavily on the city's enterprise learning initiative system. And so the training is now provided through half-hour, 45-minute snippets of time when we can pull staff from the floors.
And did you hear any, commentary from the floors, from the homes, from, personnel or patients about how they might have been adversely affected by that?
I'm not sure there was a direct correlation. However, there was significant unrest where we did hear concerns from staff and whether or not families of residents were picking up on some of the concerns. Also expressed some concerns around staff coverage. But generally speaking, I would say that there was minimal impact, that we were able to get through the change, and we're pretty much now normalized. That's a part of how we're doing business.
You do surveys of the families of residents, don't you?
Yes, we do.
And can you tell me a little bit about customer satisfaction, what level it's at, if it's rising, if people are generally satisfied with the care that's being provided?
We are just in the process of tabulating our 2017 results. They are down from previous years. We are still at par with the rest of the long-term care home sector, but there has been some measurable decrease in satisfaction.
Like a significant decrease?
I wouldn't describe it as significant. It's concerning, obviously, to us.
To what would you attribute that? Is it food? Is it activity? Is it lack of, timely care?
It could be a range of those, because we do, as I say, we're still in the process of analyzing where the various concerns are. I think the general comment we hear most is insufficient staff levels, and we have certainly over the last several years not seen the kind of adjustments that is really needed relative to the care levels of the residents that we are serving.
It says the staff complement will increase next year by 16?
That is correct.
Is that frontline people?
That is correct.
Frontline, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Nunziata, then Mihevik.
Okay, just, so at our long-term care homes, do we have family council at all our buildings that meet regular?
Through the chair, yes, Councillor. We have a family council in each one of our homes. Even before this became part of the legislation, the City of Toronto had a tradition of having family committees because we are very strong on stakeholder engagement. We also have resident councils in every home as well, so that we have a formal forum, plus we have other ways and means of connecting with residents and their families.
So there is great participation in it, like families engage?
That is correct. They do through that forum. We also offer education sessions as well, so a number of topics that are relevant of interest to families and to the residents themselves.
So how often does the Ministry of Health go into our homes and they investigate, and they do certain investigations in all our homes and to see if we're meeting the provincial standards?
The Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care have a process where they have an annual visit, if I can call it that, to each home where they do a full inspection. They also will arrive if ever and whenever there is a complaint, whether it be from a resident, from staff, from families. So they will come in for those investigations. They will also investigate whenever there is what is described as a critical incident, whether it be a fall or another situation that we have to report every kind of critical incident, that we've always maintained a forum within our division for reporting those, but we also report those to the ministry. So inspectors are routinely, I would say, in the homes.
Okay. So do you know how many complaints from family members have gone directly to the Ministry of Health rather than to the nursing home?
Technically speaking, all complaints go to the ministry, so even if a family or a resident has given a complaint to us, we voluntarily will report that.
Oh, okay, so it doesn't go directly to them, and then you're not aware of it?
It can happen that people will choose to report directly to the ministry, in which case then we may not have that. But we have always been trying to encourage people to allow us to solve a problem. But even if they have complained and we've solved the problem, we do report that to the ministry ourselves.
Yeah, I have parents in a nursing home, so I went through that whole process. Page 43, your 2017 key service accomplishments. Open phase 2 of Kipling Acres, but then also with a new community hub space. So what was that?
At Kipling Acres, we have a few services that are provided at the Kipling Acres location. We have always had one of the city's children's day centers there. We also operate an adult day program out of Kipling Acres. And specific to the Phase 2 opening, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, they have, that had been located on the same property, West Acres, which is a seniors community center, and it was an aging building, not properly or not well heated, etc. So we had space that we were able to accommodate them, and it's provided a wonderful interaction that residents, volunteers can interact with this recreational center. And we're also getting some of those individuals to serve as volunteers in our homes too. So it's a wonderful way of bringing the community into the home.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councilman Havoc.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just wondering about the dinner service. So last year, if I recall right, we made some cuts on the dinner service. And are we doing that again this year? Or tell me the pluses and the minuses of that, because I think the province threw in some money, we cut last year, and I think to meet your zero increase, you cut some as well there. Or tell us about that.
I don't recall the mealtime service being negatively affected last year. So what we did that last year and this year is we routinely review the meals that we prepare for non-resident meals, I guess. Particularly the Meals on Wheels program, et cetera. So we adjust our staffing levels depending on the number of meals that we supply to agencies for Meals on Wheels service. We have to, when it comes to meal service, whether it is a resident meal or a non-resident meal, meet minimum staffing standards. And we have set our staffing standards at the legislated minimums for providing services to residents and for non-resident meals. So there will be that adjustment for the non-resident meals, but it's not an erosion of service. It's a maintaining of the service.
But it is taking it down a notch. It's at the
adjusting.
standard, but you're saying before it was well above the standard, now we're taking it down a notch.
No, sorry, it's based on the number of meals that we prepare.
Oh, I see.
So the staffing ratio deals with the number of meals that we serve to residents, where we have to have a certain number of dietitian hours, a certain number of food handler hours, and also when it comes to supervision. Because the money that is provided by the province, it comes in, if you will, a funding envelope where private sector can produce profit. So they have prescribed staffing standards that need to be met, and we use those staffing standards to meet compliance.
I see. The big question for me, though, is around our aging population. And if I recall right from the various reports at CDNR, we are in a renewal stage, but we have not discussed expansion. How will we be fitted out in 5 years, 10 years? Is there enough in the private sector to manage it all? Or are 10 shelters, I've got shelters on my brain, 10 homes for the aged, are they enough for the bubble that's in front of us?
That is a good question. There is expansion now being planned by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care because of the aging population. They have already indicated an additional 5,000 beds to be allocated throughout the province. There is a desire to increase the number of beds. Currently, there's 84 long-term care homes in Toronto, 10 of which are city-owned and operated, which supply just over 15,000 long-term care beds. So they wanted to increase that. The difficulty that the province is now having is a number of operators of long-term care homes in Toronto have signaled that they are planning on closing beds or relocating beds to other parts of the city outside of Toronto where land is less expensive. We don't know exactly the number of homes that are planning on closing, but it is increasing the pressure. And if you noticed on the budget notes, page 2, it shows the relative number of beds, long-term care beds that are available in Toronto, including all operators, is lower than the provincial average. So there's a problem that is going to happen in a few years' time.
So, are you reporting to CD&R on that? Like that this is more a long-range thing, so I'm not sure it'll affect this year's budget, capital budget. But how do we get that in the right line so you can report out to council that, and especially if private operators are moving outside Toronto, that will only increase pressure on players like ourselves to provide inside Toronto. And of course, a lot of that is provincially funded. So what's the line how do we get that conversation going?
Right now, the information, just as I've responded here, is mainly anecdotal. We don't have hard numbers to supply as to how many beds are potentially going to be closed, how many long-term care homes in Toronto are going to close. Even the number of beds that are being planned for allocation, because the province has not yet allocated where the beds are to go across the province. So I mean, it would be largely an information report with mainly anecdotal type information, so I don't have anything of real substance to report.
But could you tell us that when appropriate information comes from Ministry of Long-Term Care, Health and Long-Term Care, whatever the title is, that you will report to CD&R on opportunities, or do you need a motion to say that, to do that?
It's your last question, and I believe Juliana had an answer for that.
Chair, you keep in mind as well that the council, we're working through on the Tenants First report, the development of a senior strategy and a seniors entity. And we're working very closely with the LHINs in the province on what that might look like, because the province very much has an interest in supporting seniors. They realize that that's a growing segment of our population. So there'll be more information coming forward.
So that's going to go through CD&R, not through budget. Is that, first, we need to do some CD&R work rather than budget work, right?
I believe that's correct. It'll go through, but I believe it's going to go through executive committee.
Okay, well, okay.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
Thanks.
Oh, yes. It's sort of an overview question. We see about $1 million worth of efficiencies that bring you down to your target. And they're sort of loosely described as work in how we deliver dinner service. And that was the place we went for efficiencies last year. But we also see additional funds coming in from the province. There are we got a $1 million efficiency, but we have $2 million coming in. how can you assure us that we're not making efficiencies and really just covering off on that by spending the province's funds? Are the province's funds going to go to the purpose they were designated for, and the efficiencies don't end up gobbling those up?
What I can assure you, when it comes to the areas of nursing and personal care, we have not decreased our staffing levels, and because our care levels are increasing, so the additional resources that are provided by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care do get allocated across to the 10 homes. It's really a nominal amount when you look at it, because we do operate 7 days a week, 24 hours, so additional staffing may appear on a night shift, for instance, on a weekend where a family may not see that increase. But when it comes to the efficiency side of it, we have not decreased any of our staffing levels that are providing direct care and service to the residents.
So if not staffing, where do you find $1 million? If it's not in bodies, are they getting, less cheese in the sandwiches, or what's happening?
No, through the chair, the way we are funded, the funding comes in little pieces. So food money you have to spend to get food dollars. It all has to be spent there. The efficiencies that we've come up with, much of our efficiencies through a line-by-line review. So half of that $1 million would be adjusting where there's some reduced hydro costs or energy type costs. So that takes care of part of that. We have an ongoing process where we continuously are looking at improving our operations through mainly the back office services. And we identify opportunities, whether it's increased automation or just finding ways of consolidating, streamlining our business processes, and where we can adjust staffing, perhaps to remove one position and put in a different skilled position so that we can produce some savings.
Right, and council did, we talked about that last year, and council did know, and I think there was a report to CDR as well, for where in some cases we're realigning so that registered nurses become nurse practitioners in some cases, where it's a matter of sort of palliative care skills that the nurse practitioner might have. But are we keeping, is there a long-term care standard for that? And are we keeping to those standards so that while we can reimagine some positions as a registered nurse could actually be a nurse practitioner, we're keeping within a high bar of standards? I ask because, as you know, we're supposed to be setting the bar for private long-term care homes. Are we maintaining that high standard as we redescribe these nursing positions?
Through the chair, absolutely, we are maintaining our standards. Nurse practitioners are funded separately than any other funding, so you cannot take, say, registered nursing hours and invested in nurse practitioners. So nurse practitioner is discrete funding. There's also other discrete funding that is provided in order to support particular initiatives such as behavioral supports as an example. So as far as staffing standards in nursing are concerned, they are mainly defined on an outcome basis. So you do not have hard ratios in nursing that you would see, say, in food production and service. So we continuously are looking at best practices, leading practices out there, ensuring that we are meeting the standards that are legislated, and also in ensuring that we're providing the highest quality care. So we have done a lot of work around our model of care, and recently towards further automation there in electronic healthcare record as an example. We've re-looked at the scope of practice of our registered staff and thinking in terms of what work could be done by other staff. So yes, very much we are mindful of that, and we have not decreased our staffing levels at all, unless our care levels were to drop, in which case we would adjust to the level of funding.
Right.
Thanks, Councillor.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Fletcher, it's your turn.
Yes, I think this is more a policy matter, and for Juliana, Ms. Carboni, that we've just identified, we have a number of homes, but there's a real pressure in the city around long-term care that's growing. And probably not something that we would deal with in the budget, but what is our plan? How much is it going to cost us to figure out exactly the situation and what the pressures are on the long-term care homes, what replacement opportunities there might be, and what the issues are that face people that are aging and need long-term care?
Through the chair, this is
I'm sorry, it's hard for me to hear because I've got, sorry, I can't hear. Go ahead.
Through the chair, unlike Children's Services, where we're the service system manager, in the case of long-term care homes, it's the LHINs and the province that takes the lead on managing the system.
Totally.
As I mentioned, we are working quite closely with them because we want to understand what the pressures are within the city, but it's very much the LHINs that are the lead on that. And as we will be working through the work we're doing with the senior strategy and the seniors entity on what that might look like, and we'll bring that information forward as we develop it.
So it looks to me like on page 30, I may be wrong, but that long-term care, not page 30, one of these other diagrams you've got here. Oh, page 18. Long-term care homes, we spend 261. Do you see it there? 7.3% of the budget, page 18. And then we look down there, it's 47.4. So do we get the rest of that funding, the delta there? Does that come from the province? Where does the delta, where does the money come from?
Majority of
we
that
don't
comes
spend with property taxes.
The majority of that comes from provincial funding.
From provincial funding. And there's no fees or services attached to?
There are some fees, but the vast majority of that delta is provincial subsidy.
So how much would the fees be that people are paying in our nursing homes?
Through the chair, the fee structure is set by.
I just mean total volume of dollars that is paid to us by people who are living in the home, not what the fees are.
We're just looking up that number now, but just to explain that residents who reside in basic accommodation are eligible for rate reductions.
Understand.
And the differential is made up by the province. So the user fees within the 2018 budget are at 51.4 million.
So that's the user fees, and the rest just comes to us for the operation from the province?
Just to clarify, there's targeted funding for a number of different things, so it's not just a large sum of money that can be used at our discretion.
Right. But it's operational dollars.
It is to operate.
That are coming.
Yes.
So that 50, so that's part of the 212. 51 is part of that, and then 47 is from taxes, and the rest is just operational dollars from the province of Ontario for these. And now, remind me how many homes there are again that we have?
We have 10 long-term care homes that supply 2,641 long-term care beds.
And do we run long-term care beds out of any other facilities in any way, where there might be a home or a senior's home that also has a little function for some long-term care beds, or not? Just solely in homes?
Currently, we just run the 10 long-term care homes, but part of the work we're doing through the seniors.
Could you move that microphone over a tiny bit? Oh, thank you.
Some of the work we're doing through the seniors strategy and the seniors entity and transforming our social housing network is looking at what as we develop future long-term care homes, whether we should be accommodating more affordable housing above those homes. So we are looking at a variety of strategies on how we might be able to address the needs.
So for West Don Lands and the Port Lands, are we building in any long-term care homes in those locations? Have we built that in at this point? No? I don't think so.
Not right now. That's not what we're looking at right now. What we're looking at is we have, as I mentioned in my...
No, I understand, but we've not built in that type of housing in any of our planned communities on the waterfront. That is my question.
So as I mentioned, it's the province and the LHINs that are the lead in terms of adding beds, and if they want to add additional beds in the city, whether it be through municipal beds or other providers, we would work with them to identify those sites.
Thank you, Councillor.
Because there's so many beds being lost in the downtown. We can put them
Okay.
in their storefronts.
Seeing no other questions, I believe we are finished. Thank you. Next, we have Toronto Employment and Social Services. Thank you for coming. Do we have any questions on Toronto Employment and Social Services? I don't think we have any actually questions, so there we go.
It seems like nobody's ready when they sit down, right?
Did you have questions, Council? Because, anyway. We're now on to Parks, Forestry, and Recreation because nobody had questions. You got to be quick.
There's no questions on parks.
They're on target, so.
Surely Francis had last year.
What's that?
Mr. Chair, just, I don't have any questions of Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, noting, though, that I am actually trying to do it offline.
Okay.
And they'll be reflected in briefing notes, but
Okay.
I know the information that I need to know.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, I think they're doing a great job, so. I mean, my playground areas are great.
Okay, welcome. We'll begin with questions of committee members.
All right, we don't.
Councillor Campbell does.
I had an interesting conversation with the vice chair of the TTC, who's a Toronto Island resident, last night about ferry service. And just wondering, what revenue does the ferry service bring in, and does it cover operating costs?
I'm going to get you the exact figure through you, Mr. Chair.
Says
It does cover operating costs, though, and we've actually been able to contribute some of the surplus from the ferry revenue into the ferry replacement reserve.
Aha,
I'll get you the exact number.
right, okay. I'll ask another question. I asked a question last year about free recreational services and the cost of recreational services. We have the welcome policy in some facilities, and then we have, how many facilities do we have where we run completely free recreational services?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the Welcome Policy is actually a universal program that's available across the city, so
Okay.
it's not community center-based, it's needs-based.
Right?
And we have 39, Howie? Oh,
39,
number of-
through the chair,
number of free
39,
community centers.
39 free centers.
39 free centers. And I know the New York Community Center opened in, I think it was February?
That's correct, and it also just.
Free, yes, I've been. It's a lovely facility.
It's a free community center.
Spectacular,
Yeah.
yes. I haven't used the facility. Francis, just, chill, Francis.
So,
But
Councillor,
no, like, the question is, has the opening of that facility and the free services offered there, what impact has it had on other area facilities in terms of registrants, in terms of participation in those other facilities?
So through you, Mr. Chair, the York Community Center programs are doing very, very well, and they're very, very full.
Right.
We have not experienced any reduction in program registration in other areas of the city as a result.
Okay.
We have adjusted some programs, as an example, at the Centennial Recreation Center, which was nearby, and refocused those programs to youth.
Okay.
But we have not seen a reduction. We've actually seen, as we documented in a report to Community Development and Recreation recently, an increase in the amount of waitlisted participants we have currently.
Okay. All right, that's all my questions. Thanks.
Okay, Councilman Havoc.
Yes, on the capital side, do we still have that, I heard that, sorry, and I haven't gone through the capital side in great detail, that we've eliminated, or you've eliminated the small capital projects on a per ward basis. So someone needs benches are knocked down, or a road is in disrepair. And I think it used to be 50,000 per ward, and I think it went to 100 at one point.
So through,
Has that disappeared?
I'm going to let Mr. Schreiner ask him to answer.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's the parks rehab program. Last year in the 2017 budget, it was at 1.75 million. This year we've raised it to $4 million. Sorry, $4 million. And that does get distributed into the 4 districts and then down to the wards through the parks technical services section.
Okay, so each ward notionally would have about $100,000 to spend on repairs. All things being equal, which I know they never are.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, that's correct. And then the items would be identified with the local park supervisor around those that
So
are.
we're good on that front. Okay, that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Nunziata.
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. Not about my community center, no. But just a question on new playgrounds in the various wards. Whenever there's a new playground in a particular park, we hire a consultant, we hire a designer, and then we pick the company that's going to bring in, there's different choices to bring in the playground. So is there not a way of savings if we, if Councillor Campbell he has a new playground, Councillor Mihevik, myself, can we not just do that all at the same time, use the same consultant, use the same would there not be a huge savings rather? Because I'm told that every playground that we do, every park, like we're spending all this additional money. I mean, the playground itself doesn't cost anything. It's all the consulting fees and everything else that we're paying for. Is there any way we can consolidate that and do them all at the same time and use the same consultant? I mean, it makes sense.
Through you, Mr. Chair, we do some of that pooling of consultants and you know, what we call blanket orders around some equipment. You should note that every park and every playground replacement is a little bit different based on the geography and the location of that particular program. And some of the background work may be different around utility locates and all kinds of other things that may be involved, concrete laying and the rest of it. We are actually, with Mr. Schreiner's staff, reviewing exactly what you're speaking about right now for the playground program coming up over the next several years to see if there is any further pooling of contracts that we can do for playground equipment and consultants. So it's a great question, and I know Mike wants to add something to that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, during the 2017 capital budget, Council approved 2 temporary landscape architects to help address the playground program. And what they've done, they work in-house and they have helped eliminate the fees that are going towards the consultants by doing a lot of the work in-house. So we have also approached it that way as well, to help put more money into the playground versus the consultant.
Because whenever I've seen a breakdown and a costing in a playground, it's for example, let's say the budget is 150, for example, right? The playground itself costs maybe 50,000. The rest is for consulting fees. Like, it's ridiculous. So we just really have to look at that because I believe there's a lot of savings there if we can consolidate some of that. And you're right.
Mr. Chair, we're in agreement. I think there are ways that we can consolidate some of that work.
Yeah.
And some of that has begun already, but there is further work to do.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Mihevik, quickly.
Can I, just in answer to Councillor Campbell's question around the ferry revenue, $9.1 million in revenue when there isn't a flood, as we were closed for part of this year. $8 million in expenses with a net income, if all goes well, of approximately $1.1 million.
Okay, Councilor Mihevik.
Which again is my core document. A few pieces there is, one is the service plan, recreation service plan initiatives. They're not on that list, are they?
So through you, Mr. Chair, there are a number of items that were in a Recreation Service Plan report last year that are not on this list. They are in the budget analyst notes, but they're not on the new and enhanced list.
Okay. And then the other piece is council just approved revised revisions to Swim to Survive and the unmet demand for recreation programs. They're not reflected in those numbers either, are they?
So on page 18, if you're referencing 3.4, is that table 3.4?
Yes, 3.4, yeah, it's up on the board there.
3.3. Swim to Survive is referenced in that table as new and enhanced that is not included in the 28 preliminary operating budget. You can see it up there.
Okay.
And the address unmet demand for recreation programs is also referenced on that list over a 3-year period for both of them.
So we'll need a budget, a briefing note to just make sure that we have the right figures.
If that's what people are interested in, we can certainly hone in on those figures specifically.
Great, thank you. Okay, that's it, Mr.
We
Chair.
have another question?
One question on dog parks. How many, so this is Parks, Forestry, and Recreation. It's both, recreation and parks, dog parks. How many dog parks does the city have?
I believe, through the chair, I believe the number right now is about 68 or 72, in that range.
72 dog parks.
68 or 72.
And they're of different varieties, I gather. There's the new dog park, which is the expensive dog park, and then there's less expensive dog park.
So through the chair, the location of the dog park, the irrigation system available, there's all kinds of things that would impact the cost of installing a dog park.
Are all dog parks created equal?
Never been asked that question. They're not, I guess, they're all different. They might be different on size based on the geography of the park, based on the location of the park. Some are larger. We do have some standards or some minimum specifications that we work within.
And so I've heard complaints about the current standard of dog park. The dogs are unhappy with the footing. Have you heard this? Have you had this feedback?
They can make a deputation.
I was going to ask if you've spoken to the dogs directly.
They should
I think dog parks and dogs off leash areas, DOLAs, as we reference them, they can, they elicit a number of different types of comments, both positive and negative. I would say we've had a combination of all of those things. In some cases, they really, really meet the need of a community, and they're very, very well received. In other instances, we've had some issues coming forward with residents who, are not in favor of those dog parks, just like any other community installation that we make.
And are we actively engaged in trying to meet the needs of the residents and the dogs who are unhappy with the current standard?
We are trying our hardest through you, Mr. Chair.
Good. And do we have dog parks where the park is actually just a park? It's a fenced-in area where dogs can run, and it's grass. Do we have that?
Through Mr. Chair, we do not. We have designated areas as dog parks or dogs off leash areas within parks, larger parks.
Mm-hmm.
So it would not be, as an example, an entire park that is fenced in.
No, but I mean, I'm speaking seriously, where the surface is just grass,
Right.
rather than the sort of like the pebbly surface that we have, that pea gravel.
Through Mr. Chair, it does, it depends on the location.
Okay.
So as an example, I can think of two right now, that one has the pebbled surface and is fully irrigated.
Right.
And has been installed and at some cost. Another is in a natural area of the park that is away from other areas of the park that is naturally fenced through berms and other things.
Okay.
So, and a hydro, yeah, so it depends on the location. I think, through you, Mr. Chair, if through the advice of staff and the location of where this DOLA may be located, we make the consideration around whether irrigation is needed and what the surface may be.
Very good.
Thank you, Councillor. And you never know what questions are going to be asked at Budget Committee. Councillor Carroll, you have some questions.
Well, just to follow up on this, have we ever had a review back? Because we started dog parks you know, kind of on a wing and a prayer and using other city examples. Some of them have been problems and others have not. A fair chunk of them, I believe, are Section 37 funded. Have we ever had a review back on how the model is serving us and what it amounts to in staff time, that sort of thing?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we have not had a review back. There was a report several years ago with general criteria that was approved by council.
Right.
Set the standards, but we have not had a review back on it in some time.
Because I believe we're close to a decade now since we set those standards and went to town on them.
That's correct.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much. Next is shelter support, housing and administration, and also includes TCHC, if we have any more questions on that. Oh, by the way, Mike, I want to thank you. I believe this is your last time before us on Budget Committee in your retirement. Thank you for all your service. You're welcome. Welcome. Actually, we have no questions. We're good. No, kidding. Councillor Mihevc.
Actually, this is a question to, I don't know, maybe Juliana. So recognizing that we made some decisions at council last week, do we need to ask for a briefing note on what the financial implications are and how that feeds in? Recognizing that at council, we actually already asked for that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, there was a council direction for the acting CFO to report back on the financial impacts on that. So
will that be a briefing note?
We will bring that back as information in January, yes.
Okay, so that's
Unless
all.
you want to know the number.
So I don't need to ask for any additional briefing?
Yeah, that'll all be coming back to us in January. Any other questions? Okay. There we are. We're just going to have to wait till January when the information comes back.
Have the information.
Sorry.
Yeah, so
Josie. Okay. Next is affordable housing. Or the Affordable Housing Office, actually.
and no more TCH, that was your opportunity for TCH.
Hello, Sean Gadden had to step out for a provincial meeting. I'm just emailing him right now to let him know he needs to come right away, but he might be a
Well,
few
first of all, let me see, I just want to make sure, are there questions?
I do have one, and actually, I'm glad that Paul is still in the room. So, I ask this, who funds a place like Tumavut, which is in my ward, which is not a shelter, but it is a transitional, very, very short-term housing. So it's in between supportive housing and shelter. We have this category called transitional housing. Is that part of your portfolio, or is it part of shelter, support, and housing?
It's part of both portfolios. So our piece of it would be anytime we're actually doing the development of transitional housing, it's usually done in conjunction with SSHA, and they would be either responsible for the budgetary oversight of the funding provided generally, as well as any of the support services provided in the housing.
Through the chair, just to build on that a little bit, I didn't catch the name of the provider that you had spoken about, but
which is related to NAMI Res. So they have a shelter piece.
Right.
I know that that's your, at the end of the day, that's under your bailiwick. Yeah. But then they have, once you're in a shelter and you're deemed to be kind of in a good path, on a good path, you go to Tumavut, you're there for up to 6 months, more or less, and then you're ready for re-entry into the community. So the Tumavut piece is what I'm interested in on a system-wide basis.
So through the chair, for the affordable housing pieces, the Affordable Housing Office is big picture, funds the development. Shelter support and housing funds the operation. So in terms of that particular site, we do provide funding to that site for the transitional program.
Okay, so then the issue of the province is putting, what are they calling it? Home for Good program. The way the system is going to work is you folks get the capital dollars, and then it's going to go over to you folks for the operation, because most of that is going to be supportive housing.
So through the chair, the Homes for Good program, the total amount of money is $90 million. Approximately $36 million of that will be capital money, and approximately $54 million of it will be operating over 3 years. So the end of 17, and the fiscal year is different for the province than the city. The end of 17 is about 4 and change from an operational point of view. Into 18, you're about 24 million, and into 19, you're approximately 24 million on the operating side.
And what does that fund? Does it fund supportive housing, transitional housing, or shelters, or all three, or what?
Through the chair, so staying at a high level, that funding is focused on impacting homelessness. So it presumably could fund all of those things.
Okay, and you'll use some of that money to fund some of the decisions that we made last week, I imagine.
Through the chair, yes, we would be focusing some of that resource on some of those things we talked about.
Okay, but given the quantums that we kind of dealt with last week, do you think we should be asking the province, frankly, for more? Otherwise, it comes from us.
Through the chair, in terms of, as we look back at the system, there was very little development from 2007 until today. As we had talked about last week, there is some catch-up to do there, so any additional funding from other orders of government would be helpful.
Yeah, okay, that's it, thank you. I have no questions here.
No questions, there we go. So Sean can let him know he can stay at his meeting or continue that, so.
Thank you, and I'm relieved.
Next is Children's Services. First of all, just before they sit down, do we have questions of Children's Services? I think we're okay on Children's Services, so there's a happy smile right there. Next is Social Development, Finance and Administration.
I do have a...
Anybody have?
Well, I do want to ask a question about social procurement.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Just one.
Councillor, just give a sec here. Councillor Mahevik, you had some questions?
The only reason why I'm raising it is because it's not on in Appendix 3.4, and so I feel I want to ask about, frankly, social procurement. You know, more and more people linking it with the poverty reduction strategy. As I read it, social procurement is about community benefits. It's about employment equity, and it's also about
supply chain diversity.
Supply chain diversity.
So through the chair...
I haven't asked the question yet.
Oh.
Do we have... We are recognizing that other jurisdictions in the United States, England, are well developed in these policy areas. Is it not fair to say that this is going to be one of the key areas for us as a city on a go-forward basis? And so to set it up in 2018 to make sure we're on solid policy ground would be a good thing.
Through the chair, in fact, we have been spending the last couple of years setting up the policy foundation for what is broadly termed community benefits, of which social procurement is one form of community benefit. Council has a social procurement policy. Council has resourced both purchasing and social development to implement that policy to secure employment objectives and supply chain diversity objectives.
So would additional resources help us to basically be well-prepared in the new term of council to make some more significant advances?
The next phase of development through the chair is the creation of the community benefits framework, which would be an overarching policy. Additional staff to move that work. If we had additional staff, the work would move faster. We anticipate coming forward with a community benefits framework early in the new term.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions? Seeing none. Oh, Councillor Campbell.
Just in the notes, it says you provided 160 community safety and well-being workshops, and that for 7,200 residents. Where do those take place?
They are focused in communities with the highest incidence of violence. So we work with residents in neighborhoods who experience violence, both to address the community trauma as a result of a violent incident, but also working with residents to build their capacity to manage future violent incidents. So it would be primarily in the neighborhood improvement areas across the city, but not restricted in any way to those neighborhoods.
And is that solely city staff, or is that city staff with neighborhood agencies?
The work is very much coordinated with neighborhood agencies, working with whatever assets exist in a particular neighborhood to build the community capacity to manage violent incidents.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Nunziata.
Just on that point, is it not coordinated through the councillor as well? Or should it not be?
Absolutely. So whenever there is a critical incident, the crisis response staff work with local councillor offices and engage with them. It's critical that we are aligned because often the councillor's office is getting information and it's important to coordinate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillors, the next we have next is Toronto Public Health. Now we're going to be doing a presentation. We're a little ahead of schedule, so I don't think everybody from the Board of Health, the MOH, isn't here yet. Well, we've actually been going through the schedule fairly quickly, but I do believe she's on her way. The MOH is on her way. Well, there was no specific time, and we just had the whole day. But generally, in years past, we have taken a little longer to do this first section. So, why don't we take a 5-minute recess? I know, but we'll take a 5-minute recess. We're just waiting for her to show up. So if we can take a 5-minute recess just to wait for the Board of Health to come, and then we'll come back in 5 minutes. We potentially could get done by 12:30. Have the councillors come back to the Budget Committee room so we can resume the meeting. Okay, we have quorum. Okay, next is the Board of Health, and we'll be doing a presentation and asking questions after that. Welcome. Just give some introductions, and then we can begin.
Much. It is on. Am I not speaking loud enough? Usually that doesn't seem to be the problem, at least according to my family. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So good morning. I'm Dr. Eileen Davila. I'm the Medical Officer of Health and here to present the Toronto Public Health 2018 Preliminary Operating Budget and 2018 to 2027 Preliminary Capital Budget and Plan. With me today is Riaz Katra. He's our Manager in Finance and Administration, and he will be helping me get through this presentation and in particular advancing the slides for us. So before you have our agenda, and just to take you very quickly through this, as I know you have quite a bit of material to cover and all the slides in front of you. Public health is a service that is operated indeed at the municipal level, but derives its mandate and power through provincial legislation, namely the Provincial Health Protection and Promotion Act and the Ontario Public Health Standards. The main objectives of public health are to improve the health status of the population and to reduce disparities in health status by focusing on delivering on prevention at a population level so that our residents can start off life healthy as possible and stay that way for as long as possible. I know you've seen some of these data before in previous budget iterations, and in fact, what we're getting at through this slide is that there is a significant return on investment for every dollar that's invested in public health. At a very high level, since the early 1900s, we've seen an addition of 30 years of life expectancy onto our population, and in fact, 25 of those 30 years of life that have been added thus far are due to public health interventions. On this next slide, just a little bit of, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Councillor.
Chairman, maybe rather than go slide by slide, we can get to the budget, to the figures?
Well, yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, how long will the
I can make this extremely short.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, please.
Thorough, but
Absolutely. So we'll just move on then to the next slide, just to give you a sense as to how we're organized. I did indicate that we derive our powers and mandate through the provincial government. There are Ontario Public Health Standards. They divide our functions as indicated on this map. High level, here is our staffing trend. I know you've had over the years opportunity to see this. The main issue here you'll see is that we're quite steady in respect of staffing complement. You do see in front of the slides, or in the slides in front of you, that there are some changes included in the preliminary operating budget, and certainly others that we'll get to when we talk about the new and enhanced programs as recommended by the Board of Health. High-level summary on vacancy analysis. There are quite a number of vacancies that are required. Our gapping target is 5.8%, and that adds up to about just under 95 vacancies in order to meet the gapping target. So I'm just going to move right along into the operating budget summary. In front of you, you have a high-level summary of the 2018 preliminary operating budget, where it does propose a gross expenditure budget of about $247.1 million, and on the slide you have a sense as to where the money comes from. I will remind you that public health programs are largely cost-shared with the province at a 75% provincial subsidy, and 25% of the money is coming from the municipality. There are also 100% municipally funded programs and 100% provincially funded programs. Service objectives and key priority actions are as indicated on this slide, and they're in line with our general mandate, which I've indicated to you is to improve the health status of the population and reduce disparities by taking a prevention approach and focusing on health at a population level. I won't go through all the details. I think this slide is quite self-explanatory. I would like to just quickly summarize with respect to the next slide that there are some interesting issues on our horizon, particularly for 2018. We know we have impending cannabis legalization for 2018. That has some consequences and some implications for us at public health. We also have a particular situation in respect of opioids, and we will need to continue to implement our overdose action plan. And as I said, in keeping with our general mission to improve health status through prevention at the population level, we're proposing certain activities with child-friendly policies and making sure that we're increasing our partnerships with other city divisions to achieve our objectives as necessary through social determinants of health. High-level summary on how we are actually trying to achieve and effectively achieving the budget target through our preliminary operating budget. As you can see, we have undertaken a line-by-line review and effected some changes to the budget, reductions to the budget, to the tune of just under $60,000 net when it comes to base expenditure changes. There have been there are operational and support efficiencies proposed in the middle part of the slide, as you see there, totaling about $124,000 net, and some service adjustments that are proposed, I should say, totaling about $6,300 net. Now looking at what has been recommended and what was recommended through the Board of Health process, and these are not included in the 2018 preliminary operating budget. These are categories that I believe are quite familiar to members of this committee and to members of council writ large. There are requests and recommendations in respect of new and enhanced programming, first and foremost in the Immunization of School Pupils Act. This, I understand, is something that came before council last year, and that a plan was proposed and agreed to with respect to making sure that we're able to meet our obligations under the Immunization of School Pupils Act, so that we can actually adequately screen all students in our schools to make sure that they're adequately covered against vaccine-preventable diseases. In addition, the Board of Health recommended certain new and enhanced funding, as indicated on this slide, to the Toronto Urban Health Fund. This particular fund is a program that is aimed towards HIV prevention, substance use, misuse and use prevention, and as well youth resilience and mental health. There are particular requests. This is with respect to TUF. It is a 5-year plan. The request that's being made here in terms of new and enhanced is to allow for year 4 of a 5-year program. There was also a 15% budget enhancement that was recommended at the Board of Health in order to meet additional demands in certain communities in the areas of HIV prevention, substance use prevention, and youth resilience, all important issues with respect to our city. Finally, there is also a new and enhanced service that's recommended by the Board of Health in respect of the student nutrition program. These categories, again, would look familiar to members of the Budget Committee and presumably as well to members of Council writ large. The student nutrition program is 100% municipally funded, and it is a program by which food is provided to children at schools, largely premised on need. So this is a program that has been in place for several years. 2018, I believe, would be year 6 of what was originally envisioned as a 5-year program. And what's before you here is in accordance with that plan, expanding to new schools, getting to the level that was previously agreed to, the municipal funding level of 20%, and now a new piece here which has to do with expansion to independent schools. So you'll see, as indicated on this slide, the total increase associated with all these new and enhanced proposals would bring the budget increase to just a little under 5% relative to the 2017 net operating budget. High-level summary on capital budget. When we talk about capital budget items in the public health realm, it's all related to information and technology enhancements. There are, as indicated on this slide, some technology enhancements, that are legislated and required of us in order to participate appropriately in programs, particularly around infectious disease control at the provincial level. So there are provincial software requirements that we're expected to maintain. The rest actually is related to ensuring that our technology is maintained at a certain state of good repair, and as well towards information and technology projects that allow us to enhance our service delivery. So with that, I can end my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Questions? Councillor Mihevik? Now, there's also, I don't know if I just need to make you aware, there is some confidential briefing, or not briefing notes, reports that were also part of the presentation. So I just want to make council that there's one in specific on the independent schools, just to make you aware. If you haven't reviewed it, you should review it. Councillor Campbell.
I'd like to ask about student nutrition program. How many schools or how many elementary schools are receiving student nutrition?
So I would have to get back to you with respect to how many elementary schools.
Or how many schools in total?
I think we're now at 46 schools in total. No, not for the whole program. I think it's higher than that. I'm sorry, I don't have that number right here off the top of my head.
So
we'll work on getting that for you. So you're asking how many schools in total are currently funded under the student nutrition program? Is that
that's
correct? And are you looking specifically for elementary schools?
No, I was wondering a breakdown between elementary and secondary, but if you don't, I mean, that should be pretty straightforward to find out, but.
Yes, we should be able to get you that number very quickly.
And I'd be curious to know the difference between the Toronto Catholic District School Board and the Toronto District School Board in terms of number of schools that are funded. And why are we adding schools to the student nutrition program? Why would we be adding schools to the student nutrition program?
So I can tell you that the way the program has been implemented has been with need in mind. So it's the idea of actually looking at the needs in terms of the schools, and it's premised on actually very validated data that happens from the provincial level. So there's a list of schools that actually does characterize needs within schools.
It's the Learning Opportunities Index.
That's correct. That's one of the indices that's actually used in order to establish the need. And effectively what happens is that, with the schools being prioritized through that list, the province has a list, and we're effectively following that list in order to determine how best to provide funding.
So this program has been around for many years.
Yeah.
And one would think that the most schools in areas of highest need would have been priority schools that would have received it in the first few years. And then as more schools are added, they become of a lower priority. And at some point in time, does not the nutrition program wind up going into areas that are not of high need? And are you, and do you do any work to ascertain, you know, the validity of the program in certain schools?
So through the chair, you're quite right that, you know, given that the emphasis has been to try to direct towards those of highest need first, over time you are moving towards schools of lower need. But it's not that straightforward. I would say in general that is the case, but you have to recall that when it comes to actually introducing the student nutrition program into schools, there's a question of need, but there is also an assessment and a question of readiness of the school community in order to actually introduce the program. It's not just a question of money. You actually have to have a certain amount of human resource,
Sure.
volunteer or otherwise,
Volunteers,
in order to actually successfully launch the program. And some schools are just not ready to do that. So in fact, we are still putting on schools and adding schools to the program that are in the relatively higher need categories,
Okay.
as followed by the list.
So let's say you have a school of, let's say you've got a secondary school of 1,200 students, and you know, something in the neighborhood of 100 to 150 children in that school come from high-need families. Is that a school that would qualify for student nutrition?
So again, I'm not part of the, we're not the ones who come up with the list, and we're not the ones who are implementing whether it's the Educational Opportunities Index or the Learning Index. Those are actually managed through the provincial level, and we're following their list.
Right, okay. Because I mean, my concern is that I understand the rationale behind a universal program so that stigma is removed from kids
Yes.
from poor families.
That's correct.
But on the other hand, if you're in a school, I mean, in my neighborhoods, you might have a school that's in a relatively high income area with a small proportion of children who are from high or from low income families. And then the program will appear. And I'm thinking, well, now we wind up feeding rich kids. And I'm sure there must be instances where that's occurring in this program.
Yes, and one could argue that that might actually even be happening in the highest need schools. But as you indicated, the evidence does show, and we have done extensive research into this question, that a universal program is the best way to ensure that those who actually most need the service are actually getting it.
And
Just to let you know, in respect of the number of schools, in 2017, 600 schools were on the program.
600 schools. So last question, is there must be, is there some provincial funding for this?
Yes, so the idea is that, and the proposal has always been under the plan, that we would be one of 5 key partner areas that provides funding to the student nutrition program, and so the municipal contribution would be 20%.
Got it, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Councillors, we are now recessed until No. So what we're doing is we're going to gather all the briefing notes and just review a number. So what has happened in years past, Council, is we've looked at some of these briefing notes. In fact, they can almost be answered, you know, outside of the briefing note thing. So staff will have a look at them all, and we'll look. And again, probably we don't technically do this until Monday. So the last part of the meeting, and then but again, getting them in so we can have a look at them. Some of them are quite complex in their answers.